Hello everybody and welcome to another quick Python tutorial. Today we're going to talk about variables, user input, and converting data types so that we can do the arithmetic we would like to do with the variables that we would like to do it with. So first of all, a variable is nothing more than a namespace in memory. It allows us to store information temporarily and manipulate it so that we can use it as part of our processing or even our output in our program. Now in Python, we do not have to necessarily declare our variables as a specific data type. In Python, everything is treated as an object, so it allots X amount of memory for every variable you declare. Whereas in something like C or in Java, you would have to declare exactly what type the variable is so that it can allot a specific amount of memory for it. So declaring a variable in Python is actually much easier than in most languages. All you have to do is give it a name, say something like value1, and set it equal to a given number, like 2. And I can say something like value 2 equals 5. And then from there, I can do different things with it. Like I can make another variable called total equals value 1 plus value 2. Okay? So that's basically it when it comes to variables. When we go through and do certain things, I can print these things out. Value 1, I can print out value 2, and I can print out total. Let's go ahead and save and run this. And there we go. When it runs, you can see that value 1 stored the value of 2, value 2 stored the value of 5, and the total stored the value of the sum of the two. Now, a couple things you need to be mindful of. There are no spaces allowed in variable names, so if I go ahead and save and try to run that, it's going to give me some invalid syntax, okay? And it's going to show right there that I can't do that. Assignments have to be made in a right to left order. This equal sign is an operation, much like addition or subtraction. It does something. It's not like in your math class where it balances two sides of an equation. To be perfectly honest with you, it's not until after you execute this that value 1 holds anything. So 2 being the value that we would like to assign gets thrown into value 1. So throwing it in something like this, where 2 equals value 1, is going to provide you with another error, right? And you can see that you cannot assign to literal. Okay, what that means is basically I'm trying to assign to a literal, okay, 2, literally just 2, and I'm trying to give it some sort of variable thing that doesn't have any value assigned to it. So you have to make sure that you do things in the correct order. Right. Now, as far as naming conventions go, using a lowercase letter on your variable names is going to be very helpful, especially moving forward when we start talking about more complex objects and things of that nature where we might give them uppercase letters to begin with. It's also good to note that our variables that will change value should be all lowercase as we go. Now, if you do have something that is going to be a variable that has slightly more wordy, let's say, and you need something to be like first name, what I like to do is camel case, and what that simply means is make every new word, not the first word, but the second, third, or fourth, start those with uppercase letters so that you get the appearance of multiple words instead of having to actually write multiple words, because you cannot have spaces in your variable names. Another way to define variables is to use some sort of underscore. So you can say something like last underscore name. And you'll see a lot of programmers do this as well. Because it looks really neat, it does give the appearance of the space without actually having the space, which is really quite nice. A couple other things that you need to be mindful of. There are special characters that are not allowed, and you should never start with a number like 1 value equals 2. Okay? It might have an issue with that. Okay? Source must be saved, sure. And it says invalid syntax, and it happens down there. So your variables always have to start with a character. Okay? We should avoid special characters at all costs because they're reserved for other things when it comes to output and things like that. So keep them to words. You can add numbers in if you need to, like value 1 and value 2. Just make sure that the end of the variable name. Variables can store all sorts of information. They can store integers, they can store floats, okay? And then we can add them and we will get exactly what we want, okay? We will talk more about arithmetic in another video, but for the most part, you can store just about anything you want. There are more complex data types that we will get into as we go, like lists and dictionaries and tuples and objects and sets and all sorts of other stuff. But for now, storing simple primitive data types, integers, floats, strings, characters, and Boolean values is more than enough to get us going for the time being. So variables are really easy to work with. You just have to name it, okay, follow the conventions that are appropriate, and then use them appropriately. All right, so let's comment this stuff out. Now, getting user input is actually really easy as well. There's another function there called the input function, and it works a lot like the print function. Okay. The input function takes a single argument, and that's a string. That is the prompt that's going to show up on the screen when you run it. So if I go ahead and do this, and I end up running it, it says enter your name, and the execution pauses and allows me to enter my name, and then you'll notice that nothing happens. Well, the input function is a different kind of function than the print function, because the print function is what we would call a void function. It does work, and it does the work that it's supposed to do very well. It just displays output to the screen. What the input function does is it grabs information from you at the console and then returns it back to the program to be done something with. So you would never just write an input statement for input statement's sake. You would always have to write something like name equals, set it equal to a variable, or use it in the context of something that allows for the input to be useful. So if I write something like name equals input, and then I can do a print statement that says something like hello, and then I can go with this, welcome to our class, and then of course I can use my dot format that we described earlier and put name here, okay, and close everything. And now I have something a little bit more useful. I can say enter my name, and it says hello Brandon, welcome to our class. And if I were to run it again and put in a different name, you notice that it works out just fine. Jeff, and then welcome Jeff, welcome to our class. Okay, so that's a pretty useful function, the input function, and it doesn't just gather strings, it can gather all sorts of information, but the input function as its own does only return strings. So it's something we need to be mindful of as we're going through certain things that we need to be careful of when we do things with digits. So for instance, let's say I come in here and I go back with value 1, and we do the same sort of logic that we did before, but we grab it through an input function. Enter a value. And we say value 2. And then we'll total. Okay, not terribly difficult math. Let's print out the total. We'll say something like value 1 plus value 2 equals our total, and that's exactly how we will set it up. So we'll go dot format, and we'll type in value 1 comma value 2 comma total. So each one of those curly braces will get each one of those values in order. So value 1 plus value 2 equals total. Now let's go ahead and run this and see what happens exactly. So it says enter a value. Let's say we enter a 4, we enter a 3, and then it says 4 plus 3 equals 43. Now, to most people, that doesn't make a ton of sense. If you understand some programming and computer science, that may make total sense. This is an idea called concatenation, where we actually add together two strings, and it's a fairly useful premise where we want to combine information in string form. All it does is it kind of slams it together, but it would be more useful for me if I could actually add those two values and get a 7. So that's where there are a couple functions that come in handy that allow us to convert information from one form to another. A couple of these functions are functions like int, okay, or float, okay, and what they will do is take a valid string, a string that is of type integer or can be represented in type integer, or a string that can be represented in type float, and change them accordingly. So let's say I did something like this and I reassign value 1 to be whatever the integer version of value 1 was, and I reassign value 2 to be the integer version of whatever value 2 is. Right? Now if I run this program one more time, I grab value 1 and value 2 by input, I change them appropriately, and then I come up with the total. So if I run this again, we come down here and we see enter value 1, I say a 4, enter value 2, it's a 3, and now we get 4 plus 3 equals 7, which is much more appropriate for my input. Now this one thing does look a bit verbose. It looks like I could probably do this in a much shorter way. So what I can do is actually wrap functions within functions. As long as the argument for the function can be given by another function and return a type that's acceptable, that's okay to do. So what if I, instead of doing it this way, take this out, and I just do this, int of value 1, or input, and I wrap this in an integer function as well. Whoops. And so essentially what this is going to do is just like anything from any other math class that you've worked with. PEMDAS, it works from the inside out, work from the smallest grouping symbol out. So here, it will gather input from the user, it will come in as type string. Whatever I type in will then get converted to an integer because that function is wrapped inside this other one, and then it will finally get stored in value 1. And the same thing with value 2. So if I go ahead and run this now, you'll notice that we get basically the same idea. If I type in a 4 and a 3 still, I get 4 plus 3 is 7, which is very, very useful for me. The other functions that you can use are of type float, okay, where I can then change these to decimals. And even if I don't type in a decimal, it will convert it to a decimal to have a 0.0 associated with it. So if I go ahead and run this, you'll notice that I can type in basically anything I want, like a 4 and a 3.5. You're going to notice it says 4.0 because I did say convert that value to a float. So that value as a float is a 4.0. And I converted 3.5 from a string to a float, so I got 3.5 and I got 7.5. Now one thing you will have to be mindful of is that if I did decide to put this as an integer and enter a float value, it will have an issue with that because it won't know how to deal with it. So I just screwed up some spacing here, it looks like. Okay. So let me get this back to where it was. Right. Let's F5, run, and let's try and enter a float for the first value, and it comes up with an error. It says invalid literal for int with base 10 4.5. Specifically, this is telling me that let's make sure you can see that. Oops. Specifically, what this is telling me is that 4.5 can't be converted to an integer because it's already a float and it doesn't know how to do that. So you need to make sure, for at least these early programs on that you're going with, is that you're asking specifically for the right type of input. Enter a value may not be specific enough. It should maybe say enter an integer value. Alright, so be specific with your prompts so that we know what we're getting to. So that's basically it when it comes to variables. Variables are more or less just a namespace in memory. They have to go on the left side of an equal sign. They must be one word, okay? No spaces allowed. You cannot start with a digit, and there should not contain any special characters. You have the ability to get input from the input function. It requires one argument, and that's going to be a string, and that's the prompt that will show up on the screen. It will always take what you type in and return and give it back to the program, so it must be used in some sort of meaningful way, oftentimes in an assignment statement like we have written here. And the last thing, converting the data types. Everything from an input function always comes in as type string. So if you need something of a different type, you need to make sure that you use one of these constructor functions for integer, float, or specifically str for a string to convert it as such. And we'll talk about that one later on when it's more useful. But that wraps up our video on variables, input, and data types. So go ahead and watch the next video that's going to cover arithmetic so that we can get more into the math part of it. Thank you.